Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm a social studies educator, historian, and host of this, the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm also an avid collector of popular culture artifacts. I love what I find at thrift store outlets, garage sale leftovers, and what I spot just making my way around the built world. I enjoy sorting through boxes of free books and magazines, not to mention online collections like Internet Archive, and of course the Library of Congress. But you don't need to spend your time digging through bins or following online rabbit holes to get a look into the past. The movies and TV we watch, the books we read, and the games we play are all documents of the past. So is fashion, food, music, toys, even the roads we travel on and the places we live and work in. Everything is a primary source. This podcast is the result of exhibiting these kinds of artifacts in public, getting passersby to select an item they connect with, and then chatting with me to see what it says about the time, place, and people who made it. The conversation you are about to hear, therefore, is your history, my history, our history, through popular culture. So, Spencer, here we are again.
Yeah, it's been a couple of years, apparently.
I was going to say 2 years.
Feels like yesterday.
To the day. It does, because and our two podcasts. So remind everybody what your podcast is.
So I'm one of the co-hosts of the Dime Comic Bros Network. We have a couple of podcasts. There's Dime Comic Bros, the main show, as well as Dime Gaming Bros. It's me, a couple of my buddies. We talk about comic books, anime, manga, pretty much anything in like the pen on paper nerd world type stuff, the print media for the most part, stuff like that.
So you were one of my first guests ever for podcast karaoke 2 years ago at Free Comic Book Day. And
you were about 10 feet that way.
Yeah, and so on my table of all sorts of stuff, and you chose Batman Year One. It's a fantastic comic, isn't it?
It's one of the greatest. Batman is tried and true material at this point, but admittedly, a lot of that ends up actually stemming from this book. You have a question, which kind of springboards me into why this book is so important, I think.
So of all the questions that we could ask about a primary source, we're going to go with, why did they make it?
So at the time, this was shortly following the first real reboot / crossover of DC Comics history, Crisis on Infinite Earths. So at that time in, 86, 87, they needed to have a new origin story for a lot of their main heroes, or a more condensed history after this first universe-spanning, continuity-changing event. So they got old, reliable Frank Miller, or at least old, reliable at the time, from his previous work on Dark Knight Returns, and David Mazzucchelli to do another origin story for Batman, which is pretty straightforward in terms of its storytelling and everything kind of included in it. But it's kind of the foundation of almost everything we know as modern Batman media.
Yeah.
Like every single adaptation, particularly the most recent film, The Batman, takes heavy inspiration from this book.
Well, I remember seeing that too because I read this years later. I mean, this is like after I think all three of the Christopher Nolan Batmans come out, and I remember reading it, I'm like, I see a lot of Batman Begins in here too.
Yep.
Where they basically, because I think it's interesting because 1989, the following year, is when the movie comes out, and that seems to be setting the standard, or at least the lineage for Batman for the next couple decades or so. But for the comic book reading world,
especially for like the general public. I think, me and my contentious opinions, I don't actually like Batman 89 that much. Loved it as a kid, but it's neither here nor there. But that was what really pushed it into like the public space, and a lot of like general awareness and cultural osmosis kind of started from that. But in terms of comics, like there's always a footnote next to almost every single Batman story these days, whether it's in print or it's audio, podcasts or film adaptation or whatever. And it's like there's heavy inspiration from Year One. It's just such a clean story. It's really well self-contained. It's very simple in its storytelling, and it's very timeless.
Have you ever seen the animated version of it?
I have. It's really, really well done.
I loved it.
A lot
of it was cool.
Yeah, a lot of DC's like one-to-one adaptations of their graphic novels from those would be like the late 2000s, early 2010s. Those ones are really, really well done. And Year One is definitely up there.
Because it's almost like a cause and effect thing that why DC made it may have almost preempted the reason for it. And what I mean by that is I feel like Batman, the general public Batman, got all sort of contorted throughout the 90s where were they preempting things by being like, this is the Batman we want you to know is this one. Maybe I'll start that all over. What I mean by this, what I'm trying to get at is, while watching the animated version of it, while reading this, I'm like, this is like a crime story that I've always wanted.
Right.
Had Batman in the comics kind of taken a weird direction by the mid-'80s that they're like, yeah, we could use a reset.
It definitely did as well because, the late 70s, early 80s were not terribly kind to Batman. There were a lot of really good stories, mostly written or edited by Neil Adams, which were really, really well done. But there was a lot of goofy shenanigans that a lot of people know and hold fondly now, in retrospect. And then the 90s also threw Batman for another loop yet again because the comic industry collapsed. DC, I nearly went bankrupt. Marvel went bankrupt, and they had to. The whole market just completely shifted. The '90s Edge era hit Batman really hard. So it is interesting because then when the early to mid 2000s hit, and then you get the beginnings of the Nolan trilogy, it kind of rubber bands back to this status quo, which happens every couple of years in like a more of a microcosm. Every new adaptation or film version, new comic book status quo, it always kind of ends up rubber banding back to like Batman solving mysteries in Gotham and just getting the crap kicked out of him. Like that's the core more than anything else. You can put all the fancy strings on top of it that you want. You can make him go to space, do whatever, but most people's like core Batman inside the heart, is a mystery book.
And that's like the first iteration of him is Detective Comics.
Yeah, it's literally in the name of his first appearance.
Where it's just like he's a detective and he just happens to wear a black mask, cowl thing.
He's certainly got to get up.
And, kind of reflective of a lot of those other kinds of vigilante type characters from the same time period. But and when I remember seeing the 1989 movie, and I spoke about this a little bit earlier today with another guest, but and on the podcast about that episode that I did, that was actually my very first podcast, was about 1989's Batman.
Yes.
And this book does a little bit too, where I don't want to say it's not an anachronism. It's kind of hard to tell what time period it's set in, though. Because they just borrow images from like gangster movies, but in this one, you can see a little bit more 80s in it, but there's also, some of the baddies look, or even the good guys are wearing trench coats that look like they could be from a little bit more noir style to them, and it's, I don't know, it's a little bit all over the place, but what it sounds like to me is that the real inspiration behind something like this was very much an internal decision, that DC was noticing it. Can you think of a reason in the 80s why sales and their success was flagging a little bit? What would be a reason why they had less readers, less subscriptions?
So, as a 23-year-old, I was not alive in the 80s, sadly for me. From my fairly limited history, my limited knowledge of the history at the time, I mean, I can blame everything on Reagan. That's an easy get for anything. But seriously, I honestly wouldn't know that much. Do you have anything in particular?
Well, I know that I was a little kid, so I can't say for certain. I mean, I knew comic books were around, and I think it kind of, based on our conversation we had last time, was about the Ninja Turtles. There was almost like a underground comics were starting to come up because they were exciting and fresh and new, and the Turtles were unlike anything anybody had ever seen.
Right.
Whereas some of these other characters that the big comic book companies were still using, like Superman and Batman and Spider-Man, between the two big companies, were getting kind of tired, and people were getting bored with them, and they were seeing like, oh, just another one of these stories over and over again.
Yeah.
Let's see something new and fresh. And so you can't take away any other thing that this is year one, meaning it's fresh and new.
Right.
That you're going to visit a Batman that is not well known in Gotham, that you're going to get that excitement that maybe didn't even exist back in the, what was it, 30s or 40s when he was first introduced. Because, I mean, to be honest with you, in all the different versions of Batman and I had in the movies, there's nothing better than his first appearance. And while we're talking,
you're
Batman's
allowed to have your wrong opinion.
Well, I just love it when he shows up and nobody knows what he is.
Yeah.
And like, who is this guy? And like, I'm Batman. Or like over here. All the different. That happens in this book, where the bad guys don't know who this guy is.
Yeah.
They don't have a whole plan in place to defeat him.
It's just a random rich dude running around in his pajamas and getting the snot kicked out of him. It's certainly a bit of a culture shock. Especially just in terms of DC during the 80s, there was just a lot of bloat in like their general lineup of comics. There was so many different timelines running at the same time because every new writer who took on a character would just randomly change history for whatever X, Y, and Z character. So it'd be like, oh, there's actually 4 different versions of Jay Garrick Flash from way back, and they were all existing on different timelines and planets, and it was really confusing. So they just were like, let's just chop almost everything down to like try to condense it into 1 or 2 main lines here, and then move forward with something a little bit more sensical. Especially as sensibilities were changing, we were kind of moving away from a lot of the really, really over the top stuff. The 80s were rough from what I've gathered.
Well, it depends on whose perspective, but I guess from a commercial one, which seems to be the driving force in this, and you got to think about what else was out there or emerging to take, especially the main audience, which would be, this particular one's not geared towards kids.
Right.
It's more of a young adult audience, but even they were being distracted or taken away from the comic books that they had been really deeply invested in previous time periods. That they had VHS tapes to watch. They had video game arcades.
That is true. Arcades was like peak arcade time would be late 80s, from what I understand.
And the bring home video games. Gaming culture was with Nintendo. It was definitely on its way up.
Yeah.
That you could, and if you're playing a video game, you can't be reading a comic book at the same time.
Right.
I'm sure there's other people that know a bit more about the history of actual, the comic book industry. I know that at the beginning of the decade is when the comic book shop was becoming a thing, and kids could congregate at these shops and talk comics and share titles with each other.
Yeah, it wasn't just the corner newsstand anymore.
Right, and the guy working at the newsstand wouldn't tell you. Has
no idea. It's sent from the publisher.
He's not going to be able to suggest, like, oh, I think that you would like this storyline. But you could get that at the comic book shop. That was becoming a more. It was a fixture by the late 80s, and yet they were still. Because of that, it's the same thing that happened in the music industry too. You look at you've seen This Is Spinal Tap, right?
Yeah.
So one of the reasons why that's so fun and funny is because a group like them, with the themes of their songs and the style over the hill, rockers left over from the 60s, it's funny because in 1984, that's not pop music. Nobody was listening to that kind of stuff. They were listening to the MTV music. They were listening, pop music in the 80s was returning back to the 2-minute song, the much more flashy, exciting kind of music. They didn't fit in with that. And even the record store was starting to suffer from that. People were just like, I'm just going to go to Sears. I'm just going to go to, the mall and get my stuff that way. I can't imagine that comic books were any different. That people were like, I just don't have time in my life for all these different versions of Batman, all these different versions of Spider-Man. I just give me one.
Just give me a literal book.
Right.
And there you go.
There you go.
You have a graphic novel to just pass off on shelves.
They had to know that the Warner Brothers Batman movie was in the works, right? I mean, there's no way that DC...
For sure.
The people making this one... So I guess that's what I was inarticulately getting at before, is that, was this some kind of preemptive strike?
Maybe.
By by Frank Miller and... the other writers and artists being like, before the Super Pop one comes out, and even with that, they get Tim Burton, who, is not exactly, especially in 1989, mainstream. He's kind of an oddball. But, before we get the one that is going to be in all the theaters, that everybody's going to be getting the T-shirt of, and everybody's going to want to be...
The McDonald's toys.
Exactly.
That whole other second market was nuts.
Before that one, let's give them the gritty, crime fighter...
Maybe.
...version that we want.
I would love to jump into 80s Frank Miller's brain. I have a lot of questions for him. But,
he's the one off a deep end.
He's a little bit of he's something. He's definitely something. But maybe so. Yeah. We'll never know. That's probably something some history book will write about. Maybe you'll write that history book.
Well, we're writing it right now. We're verbalizing it. So what we're creating is an oral history, and that's going to be... We will use this time to say we invite you to add your comments about Batman Year One and what else it might mean about, or tell us about late 1980s America, or at least very much in the creative fantasy and comic book worlds, because that entire decade was definitely a transitional period for comics.
Yeah.
You have the approved by the Comic Book Authority sticker on your T-shirt. That was a product of a previous time period, wasn't it?
Quite. That was the big, what we would usually refer to as the Silver Age now, and the early Bronze Age. So yeah, the 50s, 60s, and then mostly into the 70s, and then basically when the 80s hit, most of the large publishers, meaning the big two, of course, pretty much just said, screw it, we're just going to publish whatever the hell we want, and, comics code authority be damned, within reason anyways. And then it just kind of dissipated. It just kind of went. It's a whole other just like time period of censorship, and they just stopped caring after a while. And then sales, definitely demonstrated that people weren't opposed to just letting the consumer decide what they wanted to get, instead of having some weird oversight committee be like, well, this book is inappropriate for 10-year-olds or whatever. Yeah. It's like...
Well, because look at what else was happening in media in the same time period. Movies were getting a lot more violent. TV was getting violent. I mean, you can't... I was watching the A-Team when I was a little kid.
Yeah.
Magnum P.I. There's people getting punched out and shot at on all those shows. Even our kids' shows were getting, G.I. Joe, Transformers. So how can you tell on TV what to watch? And it's like, or on the comic books, and just let anybody. So it's like that is all wrapped up into, and this is definitely a violent book.
Oh yeah.
It's just another sign of the time. So I think we did a pretty good job with just one question and one book and trying to discern it. I really appreciate you taking the time again.
Yeah, it's a known character flaw of mine. I can talk about any one thing for a great long while.
Well, you choose the right medium for it. So before we depart, how can people best hear you on your podcast?
So pretty much any audio platform under Dime Comic Bros Network. We're also on YouTube. We have clipped segments from our gaming show, just individual reviews that are clipped out on YouTube as well. And then Twitter, Instagram. We have a Substack as well as a website and an email at dimecomicbros@gmail.com. Just Google it. Everything will come up. And yeah.
Well, I appreciate you joining once again.
Thank you.
And like I said to the audience, if you want to talk more about this, well, you're probably already on everything-history.com. So by all means, let us know what you think. Take care. Popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us, and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything as a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything as a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.